3 weeks ago, when the United States officially announced a naval blockade of Iranian ports, I explicitly stated on this channel that the blockade would absolutely not produce a peace deal. I warned that it would produce the exact opposite. I predicted that it would provide Iran with the perfect justification to violently close the Strait of Hormuz again. I said it would grant Iran's military hardliners the exact political cover they desperately needed to walk away from the negotiating table. And finally, I warned that it would afford China the diplomatic maneuvering room to step even further into the power vacuum that America was carelessly vacating. I said all three of those specific things would happen, and today, all three of them have officially happened. The breathtaking sequence of events that unfolded over the past 72 hours makes the underlying logic of that prediction visible in a way that we need to walk through very, very carefully. Because the reality is not just that I happen to be right, it is that the mechanical structure producing this outcome was always plainly visible if you were looking at the right geopolitical player, while the vast majority of mainstream media coverage was entirely focused on the wrong one. Let me walk you meticulously through what has actually transpired. On Friday, Iran's Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, posted a message on social media declaring that the Strait of Hormuz was fully open to all commercial shipping. The global reaction was instantaneous. International oil prices crashed by 9% in a matter of hours. The Dow Jones Industrial Average soared over 800 points. Global markets immediately priced in a comprehensive peace deal. President Trump took to Truth Social and wrote, and I am quoting him directly, "Iran has just announced that the Strait of Hormuz is fully open and ready for full passage. Thank you." He literally thanked the Iranian government, but then he immediately added a fatal caveat. He stated that the American naval blockade would remain in full, uncompromising force. Almost immediately, Iran's own semi-official state media publicly criticized Foreign Minister Araghchi for creating ambiguities regarding the conditions for maritime passage. Iran's hardliners, specifically the commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, brutally overruled their own foreign minister on live television in front of the entire world within mere hours of his hopeful announcement. And then Iran slammed Hormuz shut again. By Saturday morning, Iranian gunboats were actively firing on 2 commercial tankers near the strait. A massive container ship was struck by a rocket off the coast of Oman. Furthermore, Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Bakir Ghalibaf, publicly condemned America's naval blockade. I want to give you his exact translated words. He called it an ill-considered and ignorant decision. He went on to assert that America had made 7 separate claims in a single hour, and that all 7 were objectively false. The IRGC then issued a blistering formal statement declaring that President Trump's words hold no credibility. That was the reality on Friday, and that was the chaos on Saturday. And yet today, on April 19th, that very same parliament speaker, Ghalibaf, the man who just called the American blockade ignorant and declared America had no credibility, suddenly announced that there had been actual progress in the diplomatic negotiations. Both of those fiercely contradictory statements occurred within the exact same 24-hour window. I want to pause and stay with that glaring contradiction for a moment, because I firmly believe it is the absolute key to understanding what is actually happening behind closed doors, and it is a dynamic that almost nobody in the mainstream coverage is explaining clearly to the public. The Iran you are watching in these frantic news cycles is not one unified Iran, it is 2 entirely different entities fighting for control. There is the Iran, represented by Araghchi, the foreign minister, the seasoned negotiator, the diplomat who flew to Islamabad, who tried to open Hormuz on Friday, and who is desperately trying to find the acceptable language for a peace deal before Wednesday, when the temporary ceasefire violently expires. That specific Iran desperately wants to negotiate. That Iran knows the suffocating economic damage of the American blockade is profoundly real. That Iran knows that if the ceasefire completely collapses on April 22nd and the heavy bunker buster bombs start falling again. The next phase of this war will be infinitely harder to survive than the last one. But then there is the second Iran, the Iran of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, the ultimate hardliners who ruthlessly overruled Araghchi within hours of his Hormuz announcement. The military commanders who issued the statement declaring Trump's words void of any credibility. The men who deliberately sent armed gunboats to fire on international tankers on Saturday, while Ghalibaf was simultaneously telling the press there was diplomatic progress. Both of these irons are completely real. They are not performing a coordinated good cop, bad cop theatrical routine for Western diplomatic consumption, although it certainly functions that way on the world stage. They are genuinely, deeply in disagreement about how to handle this existential moment. And the reason that fierce internal disagreement matters so heavily for the fate of these negotiations is that America is stubbornly trying to sign a peace deal with the first Iran, while the second Iran just keeps firing rockets at oil tankers. Now, let me explain exactly why I said the American naval blockade would permanently dash the peace deal. This is not the benefit of hindsight. The strategic logic was glaringly clear from the very first day. When America proudly announced the naval blockade on April 13th, Iran's internal negotiating position shifted overnight. Think about what that blockade actually did to Iran's internal cutthroat politics. Before the blockade was announced, the Araghchi faction, the diplomats, could legitimately argue to the military hardliners that their negotiation strategy was actually producing tangible results. They had secured the ceasefire, they had the Islamabad talks, and they had the beginning of a diplomatic framework. Their core argument to the generals was, give us time, diplomacy is working. The American blockade destroyed that diplomatic argument in exactly 24 hours. The IRGC could suddenly point to the blockade and say to every single supreme decision maker in Tehran, do you see? America announces a ceasefire and then immediately launches a suffocating naval blockade right inside it. America promises negotiations and then sends more warships to our coast. You cannot deal with these people. Every inch we give them, they aggressively take two. That is a politically devastating argument inside Iran's power structure. Not because it is entirely objectively accurate, but because it is profoundly emotionally resonant and incredibly politically useful to the military men who were always ideologically opposed to signing a deal with Washington. The American blockade was quite literally the best thing that could have possibly happened to Iran's hardliners. It validated everything they had been preaching for 40 days. I predicted that before it happened, not because I possess a crystal ball, but because that pattern was completely structurally predictable from the political logic of how the Iranian regime makes its decisions. Now, here is exactly where China enters the narrative, and I want to be incredibly precise about this because it is a highly sophisticated maneuver. China's shadow role in this war is the most consequential factor that American grand strategy has consistently failed to address. The hard evidence for that failure is now visible in public documents, leaked intelligence reports, and satellite tracking data that anyone with an internet connection can read. The Financial Times reported a massive bombshell this week, citing highly classified, leaked Iranian military documents. They revealed that Iran's Revolutionary Guard utilized a commercial spy satellite purchased directly from a Chinese company called EarthEye to meticulously target American military bases across the Middle East. Let me repeat that. Not a Russian military satellite, not a domestic Iranian satellite, but a satellite bought from a Chinese commercial entity. The satellite actively monitored American troop positions at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, at highly sensitive locations near the U.S. Navy 5th Fleet headquarters in Manama, Bahrain, and at Erbil International Airport in Iraq, perfectly aligning with the timing of IRGC claimed missile attacks on those exact facilities. CBS News separately confirmed that official U.S. intelligence assessments indicate Iran utilized satellite imagery provided by China throughout the entire conflict, a fact confirmed by 2 U.S. officials speaking under strict anonymity. Let me stay with that terrifying reality for a moment. China actively helped Iran see exactly where American soldiers were located so that Iran could hit those locations more accurately with ballistic missiles. That is absolutely not passive diplomatic support. That is not just buying discounted oil. That is providing lethal targeting capability against American citizens. And yet, America's president, when asked directly by the press about Chinese weapons transfers to Iran, casually said he doubted it. During the exact same week, his own intelligence community definitively confirmed it to the press. That massive glaring gap between what American intelligence knows as a fact and what American foreign policy is willing to say out loud is not an accident. It exists because America desperately needs something from China. President Trump is scheduled to visit Beijing in May. The high-stakes summit with Xi Jinping is officially on the calendar. The trillion-dollar tariff negotiations are currently ongoing. America simply cannot afford a full public confrontation with China over Iran at the exact same moment. It is desperately trying to negotiate trade terms and avoid a catastrophic economic rupture with the world's second-largest economy. China knows this intimately. China has been ruthlessly exploiting this exact constraint since the war began in February. But here is the deeper, more structural point. The reason I said the blockade would fail was not solely about Iran's internal politics. It was primarily about China's massive economic architecture built around Iran. And that architecture is the single most important thing to understand about why this war has reached its current stalemate. Before this war even began, Iran was exporting approximately 1.6 million barrels of oil per day. During the war, when Hormuz was supposedly closed and the world was watching global oil prices frantically spike above $100 a barrel, Iran's exports did not collapse. They continued to flow. Advanced tanker tracking services, which use satellite imagery to follow illicit vessels that have switched off their transponders, show that an astonishing 11.7 million barrels of Iranian crude moved directly to China between February 28th and mid-April. Iran is still getting paid. The American blockade has not cut Iran's national revenue because China spent the past decade building a financial and logistical system specifically designed to survive American sanctions. It relies on dark fleet tankers running with their transponders turned off. It relies on massive payments processed in Chinese yuan through second-tier Chinese banks operating completely outside the American SWIFT system. It utilizes bonded warehouses scattered across Asian waters. It employs independent Chinese refineries, known as teapots, that eagerly process sanctioned crude without the official documentation that would trigger Western compliance alerts. It uses mid-ocean, ship-to-ship transfers that make the true origin of the cargo completely untraceable. This vast system was not hastily built for this specific war. It was meticulously constructed during the previous years of heavy sanctions. This war simply made it visible to the public. And when America proudly announced the naval blockade, that Chinese system simply absorbed the new pressure and kept running. The oil kept moving, Iran kept receiving billions in revenue, and Iran's hardliners could truthfully say to the desperate negotiators on their own side, we do not need to give anything away to Washington. We can afford to wait. China is still buying. Let me give you a highly specific example that makes this shadow architecture undeniable. This week, a Chinese-owned tanker called the Rich Starry, which had been previously explicitly sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department, became the very first vessel to exit the Strait of Hormuz after the American blockade officially began. It sailed right through, it crossed directly into the Gulf of Oman, and then, for reasons that have still not been publicly explained, it abruptly turned around and sailed right back toward Iran's Larak Island, where it sat perfectly stationary in the water. America did not stop it on the way out. America did not stop it on the way back. A fully sanctioned Chinese-owned tanker made a casual round trip right through an active American naval blockade without facing a single apparent consequence. Furthermore, marine traffic data confirmed that two other Chinese-operated vessels, named the Alicia and the RHN, also freely transited near Iranian waters during the blockade's very first full day of operation. What does that tell you about the practical, on-the-ground enforcement capacity of the American blockade against China-linked vessels? It tells you that America is enforcing this blockade highly selectively. It is enforcing it aggressively against weaker vessels that lack a powerful global patron. But it is absolutely not enforcing it against Chinese-connected vessels, because enforcing it against Chinese vessels instantly creates a military and diplomatic confrontation with Beijing that Washington simply cannot afford right now. China knows this. Iran knows this. Every single tanker captain and shipping conglomerate in the world knows this. A military blockade with massive, known geopolitical exceptions is not a real blockade. It is merely a public relations pressure tactic with a very visible ceiling. And Iran's decision to call the blockade ignorant was based entirely on knowing exactly where that ceiling was. That is why I said the blockade would dash the peace deal. A blockade that completely fails to cut the enemy's revenue does not produce the economic panic required to change the enemy's negotiating position. It only produces the political cover for the enemy's hardliners to reject any meaningful compromise. Now, let me tell you what this coming Wednesday actually means. April 22nd is exactly 3 days away as I record this. That is the moment the fragile ceasefire officially expires, and absolutely nobody in Washington or Tehran seems to possess a clear, coherent plan for what happens next. President Trump stated aboard Air Force One last Friday, and I am giving you his exact words. Maybe I won't extend it, so you have a blockade, and unfortunately, we have to start dropping bombs again. He threatened to start dropping bombs again while the ceasefire was still technically in effect. While Araghchi was still on social media announcing Hormuz was open, and while global markets were rallying on the false optimism of peace. At the exact same time, a senior Iranian official told CNN that a fresh round of critical meetings between Iranian and American negotiators will take place this Monday in Pakistan. Iran confidently confirmed the Monday talks. America has notably not confirmed the Monday talks. Both of these realities cannot be simultaneously true in the way each side is presenting them to the public. Either there are talks scheduled or there are not. Either American diplomats are boarding a plane to Islamabad on Monday or they are not. That massive diplomatic ambiguity is itself a terrifying measure of how unstable this moment truly is. Here is what I believe is actually happening behind the curtain. Both sides are desperately trying to use the remaining 3 days before Wednesday as maximum leverage. Iran is signaling raw strength by closing Hormuz, calling the blockade ignorant, firing rockets at commercial tankers, and projecting absolute confidence. America is signaling strength by keeping the blockade physically running, by Trump openly threatening to resume bombing, and by holding highly publicized war cabinet meetings at the White House on Saturday with Defense Secretary Hegseth, the CIA director, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all prominently showing up together. Both sides are theatrically performing maximum pressure for the cameras, while simultaneously leaving a tiny back door slightly open for secret talks. That is not a viable path to a comprehensive peace deal in 3 days. That is only a path to a ceasefire extension, which operates on an entirely different strategic logic. A ceasefire extension simply means neither side currently has what it needs to sign a deal, but neither side actually wants the devastating war to resume right now. It kicks the hard decision forward, it buys both militaries more time to position their assets, and most importantly, it gives China more time to continue doing exactly what it has been doing. Which brings me right back to where I started. I said the blockade would dash the peace deal. Iran called it ignorant and stupid, stating America's words hold zero credibility. And China, by continuing to purchase Iranian oil through a shadow system that no American blockade can touch, by actively providing lethal targeting intelligence to Iran's military, by preparing advanced radar systems for Iranian air defense, and by vetoing the UN resolution to open Hormuz alongside Russia, proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my prediction was right. The blockade simply could not produce the economic pressure required to change Iran's negotiating position, because China practically ensured Iran would have endless revenue regardless of what the US Navy did. And the peace deal that Araghchi desperately tried to announce on Friday collapsed within hours because Iran's hardliners, deeply emboldened by that exact same Chinese backing, brutally overruled him. Let me give you a historical frame that makes China's grand strategy perfectly legible in a way that the frantic, day-to-day news cycle simply cannot. In 1950, when America entered the bloody Korean War, China was not a direct combatant in the early months. China was quietly supplying North Korea, providing logistical equipment, providing crucial intelligence, and building the military capacity of the side America was fighting, all without formally declaring war. American commanders, including the legendary Douglas MacArthur, confidently kept insisting that China would not intervene directly. They were disastrously wrong, but they were not wrong about what China was doing before the intervention. China was carefully supporting the weaker side just enough to keep it viable, without crossing the explicit threshold that would demand a direct American military response. That pattern, massive support without direct, visible involvement, is not new. It is one of the most consistent, ruthless strategies in China's foreign policy history. It was their exact approach in Korea. It was their approach in Vietnam, where China provided the surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns that shot down American fighter jets without Chinese soldiers ever visibly fighting on the front lines. And it has been their exact approach throughout decades of American-Iranian tension, where China bought Iranian oil, transferred advanced technology, and provided diplomatic cover without ever becoming a formal party to the conflict. What is profoundly different now is the sheer scale and the terrifying sophistication of that support. The Dark Fleet tanker system is vastly more developed than anything China built in previous proxy conflicts. The satellite targeting intelligence is far more direct and lethal than anything China provided to America's previous adversaries. The combination of an economic lifeline, real-time intelligence support, and a massive weapons pipeline that China has assembled around Iran represents the most comprehensive application of this proxy strategy China has ever attempted. And America's official response to this massive shadow war has been to threaten China with a 50% economic tariff, while simultaneously scheduling a polite diplomatic summit with Xi Jinping in Beijing next month. The threat and the invitation awkwardly coexist. They coexist because America's grand strategy for ending this war has not yet found a way to separate the China problem from the Iran problem. And a strategy that willfully ignores China's central role is a strategy that is foolishly trying to win a complex game, while one of the most important players is operating completely without constraint. China has been meticulously building its geopolitical position in this conflict the way a grandmaster builds a chess position. Not by aggressively attacking, not by making dramatic, flashy moves, but by quietly placing impenetrable pieces on squares that permanently constrain the opponent's options. The shadow oil purchases actively constrain America's naval blockade. The satellite intelligence permanently constrains America's targeting advantage. The weapons pipeline directly constrains America's air superiority if the bombing resumes. The UN veto comfortably constrains international consensus against Iran, and the ongoing tariff negotiations actively constrain America's ability to pressure China directly over any of the above. Every single rung of that strategic ladder was built quietly, without flashy press conferences without angry Truth Social posts, and without threatening to blow up an entire civilization. They did it simply by executing consistently over months and years in ways that everyone in Washington could see, but nobody wanted to say out loud, because saying it out loud would require actually dealing with it. There is one more highly specific thing I must say before I close, because there is a glaring detail from the past week that has been almost entirely buried under the chaotic news cycle, and it deserves its own spotlight. America's Treasury Department, on the exact same day that Iran's foreign minister announced Hormuz was open, quietly issued a waiver allowing the delivery and sale of heavily sanctioned seaborne Russian crude oil. They issued a waiver on Russian oil sanctions specifically to ease the massive global price pressure that the Iran war has caused. America lifted sanctions on Russian oil on the exact same day Iran opened Hormuz, the exact same day President Trump said thank you to Iran. Think deeply about what that actually means strategically. Russia is currently fighting a brutal war in Ukraine that America has spent hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars supporting. America has constructed the most comprehensive sanctions regime against Russia in its entire history. And yet, America quietly lifted restrictions on Russian oil because the Iran war created an energy shortage so severe that America needed Russian supply just to keep domestic prices manageable. Russia did not have to fight Iran's war. Russia did not have to deploy a single soldier or ship to the Strait of Hormuz. Russia simply had to be patient, maintain its deep intelligence-sharing relationship with Tehran, veto the UN resolution alongside Beijing, and comfortably wait for the global energy shock from the Iran war to force America into easing Russian sanctions completely voluntarily, which is exactly what happened this week. Russia profited massively from this war without fighting it. China profited massively from this war without fighting it. And both of those superpowers did so because America's naval blockade of Iran created the exact global conditions they needed. The blockade that was supposed to brutally pressure Iran into a peace deal ended up easing the pressure on Russia and providing China with the ultimate strategic cover to deepen its control over Tehran. That is the full, unvarnished picture of what the American blockade actually produced. Not a historic peace deal, not an economic capitulation from Iran, not a ceasefire extension with better terms. It produced a massive strategic windfall for both of America's principal global competitors, delivered directly by an American policy that was supposedly designed to do the exact opposite. Because the true story of this war, from the very day it started, has never simply been America versus Iran. It has always been something far more complicated. And complexity, as I have said before, does not loudly announce itself. It simply operates quietly, consistently, rung by rung. And the impenetrable system that China built around Iran has been running quietly for a decade. This war just made it impossible for the world to ignore any longer.